I didn't expect to feel anything when he walked back into our house. After all, he had grown up here. His room was still upstairs, barely touched. But now, years later, a man stood in the doorway where a boy had once been. He looked older, changed, not just in the face but in the way he stood, like someone who had lived through something he wasn't ready to explain. My husband greeted him first, of course. Their exchange was polite, practical, filled with the kind of phrases that fill up space but mean nothing. I stood by the staircase, arms folded over my chest, pretending I was just a spectator. But I wasn't. I noticed the weight of his suitcase. I noticed the way he looked at the kitchen like it belonged to another life. I noticed the pause before he looked at me. We hadn't seen each other in 5 years. A lot had happened in that time. For him, a marriage that didn't last. For me, a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow inside. When he finally said my name, it was softer than I expected. I gave him a quick, practiced smile and told him his old room was ready. I didn't expect the way my skin reacted when he brushed past me, just the faint trace of warmth from a small gesture. I told myself it was nostalgia, nothing more. That night, we had dinner together. My husband opened a bottle of white wine, the same kind we always drank on weekends. He talked about work, his voice steady and familiar, the kind of sound that blends into the background of a long marriage. I responded when appropriate, passed dishes, asked questions. I played the role I'd mastered. Across the table, the man who had once been part of this home didn't say much. He listened, nodded, observed. At one point, I looked up and caught him watching me, not in a way that crossed a line, just watching, like he was trying to recall someone from memory or understand who I'd become. I looked away quickly, my throat suddenly. Later, while my husband loaded the dishwasher, I stepped out onto the porch with a glass of wine. It was cool for early spring, the kind of air that quietly reminded you of your body. A few moments later, I heard the door creak. I didn't turn around. "You always like to sit out here," he said behind me. His voice had changed. He wasn't trying to make conversation. He was simply stating something true. "I still do," I replied, taking a slow sip, not trusting myself to say more. We stood in silence. I could feel him behind me, not close, but not far. That quiet space between us held something unfamiliar yet familiar. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. It was recognition, the kind that happens when two people remember something they were never meant to hold on to. When I went to bed that night, my husband was already asleep, one arm flung over his pillow like a claim. I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling. The image of another man's eyes settled quietly in the corners of my mind. The next morning, I woke early. I made coffee, tied my robe a little tighter than usual, and avoided the hallway near his room. But he was already in the kitchen when I came in, shirtless, a towel around his waist. He reached up for a mug, his back to me. I looked away quickly. "Morning," he said casually, like it wasn't unusual. "Coffee's fresh," I muttered, pouring a second cup I didn't need. He took it from me. Our fingers brushed briefly. A flash of awareness jolted through my hand. I stepped back, adjusting my robe. He didn't say anything more, just leaned against the counter, calm, quiet. That day passed slowly. In every room I entered, I checked if he was there. When he wasn't, I felt both relief and something harder to admit. My husband suggested a movie that night, something he'd already half-watched. I sat beside him, warm under the blanket, but somewhere else entirely. Around 11, I went to bed.
Il est there, listening to the...
At some point I heard footsteps, soft, slower than my husband's. They paused outside our door, then moved on. I didn't sleep. My fingers traced quiet shapes across my stomach beneath the sheets, grounding myself in a moment I didn't fully understand. Something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. The next morning, I acted as if nothing had changed. That was my way of coping, sealing the cracks before anyone noticed. I made breakfast, eggs, toast, orange juice. My husband kissed my temple and stepped onto the porch with his laptop. He'd been working out there more often. Said the air helped him focus. I didn't argue. Silence had become one of the unspoken terms of our marriage, like the dusty photo frames in the hallway. He came down later, dressed, hair damp from a shower. He wore a button-down shirt that clung to his frame in a way that caught me off guard. Maybe it was how he moved. Maybe it was how unhurried he seemed. Morning, he said, pouring himself coffee. I dried my hands on a towel, suddenly aware of how I was standing, how I sounded. I talked about the weather. He responded. Everything stayed within bounds. Everything but my gaze, which lingered for a second too long on the bend of his wrist. I looked away. He left for a run. I stayed behind and wandered into our bedroom. I wasn't sure why.
The mirror above, the dressing caught me off guard.
I saw a woman I didn't fully recognize. Hair undone, eyes too clear. I unbuttoned my blouse. Underneath was a plain white bra, simple worn. I removed it quietly and reached for the back of the wardrobe. Hidden in a box was something I had bought long ago. For myself, not for anyone else. Burgundy lace, soft, subtle. When I put it on, something in me shifted. Not in a romantic way, in a reclaiming way. I wasn't dressing for my husband. I wasn't dressing for the man upstairs. I was dressing to remind myself I was still here, that I could I heard the front door open. He was back from his run. A phone call ended abruptly. I didn't go out. I stayed in the bedroom, pulling on a loose shirt over the lingerie. I dabbed on a little perfume, then wiped it off again. It felt like too much, but the trace of it lingered. Quiet, real. The day passed. I did chores, ran errands. My husband brought home sushi and mentioned a work meeting on Monday. I nodded, and he disappeared into his office. I didn't follow. I didn't ask about the meeting. I didn't want to know who he became once the door closed. Later that evening, he came into the kitchen while I was slicing a lemon. He leaned casually against the doorframe, saying nothing, but I felt his gaze. The way it moved across my shoulders, paused at my neckline, followed the movement of my hands. I didn't lift my eyes. Only when he stepped closer and set a glass on the counter did I look up. He had poured me wine, my favorite, the one I hadn't bought in months. You don't smile much, he said. I paused, fingers still wrapped around the knife handle. Smiling doesn't always mean happy, I murmured, barely audible. We stood like that for a while. He at the window, me by the stove. The space between us held something too thick for words, too delicate to name. When I walked past him, his hand brushed my waist lightly, as if testing whether I would pull away. I didn't. Later that night, after my husband had fallen asleep, I stayed in the living room with a magazine I wasn't reading.
Heure de footsteps upstairs, then silence.
I turned off the lamp and walked into the hallway. His door was ajar. I stood outside it, listening to my own breathing, frozen for a few seconds, maybe more. You can't sleep, his voice said softly. I didn't go in. I remained by the door. It's late, I said. I know. The quiet that followed felt louder than anything. I clutched the fabric of my robe, grounding myself in something. Good night, I said, and turned back toward the bedroom. When I lay beside my husband, he shifted slightly but didn't wake. His hand flopped across the sheets, reaching for nothing. I stared at the ceiling, my heart unsteady. Half an hour later, I got up again. I didn't make excuses, not even to myself. I moved barefoot across the hallway. He stood by the window in a dark t-shirt, his back to me. I entered. He turned. I began. He didn't need me to explain. He took a step forward, slow and careful, and reached out, not to grab, not to demand, but to gently trace the line of my cheek with his fingers, as if confirming I was real. I didn't move. The moment that followed wasn't rushed. It wasn't forceful or unclear. It was quiet, intentional, the kind of connection that says, I see you, not I want you. And yet, my body leaned into his, as if waiting for permission to simply feel again. When I slipped back into bed, my husband was still sleeping. I lay perfectly still, my eyes wide open, the sheets cool around me, my thoughts loud. I hadn't planned it. I hadn't even imagined it. And yet, it happened. Not like a mistake, but like something inevitable I hadn't named until now. The next morning came too quickly. Light filtered through the curtains in strips, exposing everything the dark had tried to hide. I lay awake long before my husband stirred, my body still, my mind loud. I had always imagined guilt as something dramatic. Loud crashes, slammed doors, raised voices, but it wasn't. It arrived quietly, in the form of questions I didn't want to answer. He greeted me as usual, pecked my cheek, and mentioned needing to be at the office earlier than planned. I nodded, pretended interest in his schedule, and focused on pouring his coffee with steady hands. He left with a briefcase in one hand and a distracted "love you" that faded before I could reply. The house felt different once the door clicked shut, not silent, like the air had absorbed what had happened and didn't know how to carry it. I walked into the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. My lips were slightly flushed, but not in a way anyone else would notice. My eyes, though, they looked different, sharper, like they had finally woken up after years of sleepwalking. I didn't see him until later that afternoon. I had thrown myself into chores, trying to scrub away the electricity still humming beneath my skin. By the time I stepped onto the porch, he was already there, sitting on the railing with a book in his lap. He looked up, and for a moment, the air between us stopped. He didn't smile. Neither did I. I leaned against the wooden beam, arms crossed, not as a shield, but to keep from reaching. His eyes dropped to my hands, then back up. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded once. "Just tired." He closed the book, set it beside him, and stretched his legs out. I noticed the way his fingers rested on his thigh, relaxed, but present, like every part of him was paying attention, even in stillness. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It was sharp. Every glance, every breath meant something. I didn't know what we were doing, only that we both understood what had already been done. That evening, my husband announced we'd be attending a company dinner for their anniversary, a formal event at a country estate, about an hour from town. He said he wasn't sure he could make it, but it would be good if someone from the family showed up. A diplomatic appearance. I was used to being that. "I could drive her," came a voice behind me. I turned, startled to see him leaning in the doorway, one hand in his pocket. My husband looked up from his laptop. "If you don't mind, that would help." I almost said no, almost made up a reason, but the words never formed. "Sure," I said, "that's fine." The next day, I dressed carefully, not to attract, but to feel composed. A dark red dress, modest in shape but fitted. Underneath, something soft and elegant I hadn't worn in years. Not for anyone to see, just to remember how it felt. Perfume on my wrists, hair pulled back, not tightly. He waited by the car. When I stepped out, he looked at me in a way that made me glance down. Though I didn't want to, I noticed him swallow. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The drive was long, but the silence stretched comfortably. Occasionally, he glanced sideways. Once, at a red light, our eyes met, just for a moment, longer than necessary, but no words were needed. His hand rested on the gear shift close to mine. I could feel the warmth of it without touching. The venue was elegant, lit by hundreds of small lights strung between old oaks. Music played in the background, and clusters of people in suits and dresses floated past like well-rehearsed shadows. I greeted the ones I recognized, smiled when expected, made small talk that felt like smoke. At one point, he stood beside me at the refreshment table. Our hands reached for the same glass. We both paused, fingers brushing. I didn't pull away. He didn't either. That 1 second contained more clarity than entire years of routine. We slipped away quietly before dessert, not because we planned to, but because the idea of staying felt unbearable. The car ride back was darker, quieter. I could hear the engine, the tires humming over pavement, the occasional exhale from his side.
Halfway home, it started raining.
Not a storm, just a gentle, constant tapping. He turned on the wipers. We didn't speak. I watched the streaks the raindrops left across the windshield, each one erased by the blades before it had time to settle. A metaphor I didn't want to admit felt too real. When we arrived, the house was dark. My husband had left a note. Emergency call from a client. Wouldn't be home until late. I read it once and folded it slowly, as though it might change if He stood near the coat rack, waiting. I didn't move to turn on the light. I walked past him toward the living room. He followed. We didn't speak. Even as I turned and looked at him. Even as I reached up and touched the collar of his jacket. Even as he took a step closer and placed his hand gently at the small of my back. The kiss this time wasn't hesitant. It wasn't soft. It was deliberate, slow, the kind of kiss that fills a room. I felt it in my throat and the soles of my feet. He kissed me like someone who had been holding back, not for the perfect moment, but for the moment when holding back no longer made sense. We didn't rush. We didn't need to speak. It ended not with words, but with the sound of my breath catching and the way he rested his forehead against mine, like a silent apology. Later, I lay awake again.
My husband stigen.
My dress on the chair. The lace beneath it felt like a second skin, something I could no longer pretend I hadn't chosen with him in mind. I thought I knew what desire felt like, but this wasn't about longing. It was about being seen. And I realized, maybe for the first time, how long I had lived without that. I woke the next day before dawn, unsure whether I had slept at all or simply drifted in and out of restless thought. The house was silent again, still wrapped in the kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful, only suspended. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the pattern on the hardwood floor, letting the numbness settle like dust on my skin. In the soft gray light, everything looked sharper. My dress from the night before lay draped over the back of the chair, creased and faintly perfumed. My heels were still by the front door, one tilted onto its side. The black lace I had worn was folded neatly on the bathroom counter, as if I had wanted to preserve the illusion of order, of control. But the truth was something had shifted in me, not violently, just When I made coffee, my hands moved on instinct, grinding, pouring, stirring. But my mind wasn't in the kitchen. I kept hearing the sound of rain on the car roof, the moment his fingers touched my waist, the breath he drew before our kiss, like he was remembering something he'd always known. I thought of the way we didn't talk afterward, of how he didn't ask me for anything, of how I didn't offer an apology. I didn't want one. He came down late, his hair still wet from a shower, a navy t-shirt clinging slightly at the shoulders. He looked composed, as if whatever had happened hadn't scattered him the way it had unraveled me. But then again, men were good at that, wearing the surface like armor while everything underneath boiled. We moved around each other like magnets turned the wrong way. I passed him the sugar. He handed me a plate. Nothing in our gestures acknowledged the night before, and yet everything did. Our hands lingered for fractions of seconds too long. Our gazes flickered, and then dropped, like the heat. Between us was a secret we both wanted to protect and expose at once. That afternoon, I opened the door to find a plain brown box on the porch. No label, no note. Inside was tissue paper.
And beneath?
A dark emerald garment, not bold, refined, thoughtfully chosen. My breath caught. I knew instantly it was from him. The fabric was cool under my fingertips.
The lace pattern intricate.
Delicate, unmistakably chosen with care, not driven by impulse, but attention. I stood in the doorway for a long time holding the box.
The silence behind me like a verdict.
I didn't tell my husband about it when he got home. He wouldn't have asked. He was preoccupied with a new project. During dinner, he spoke at length, about budgets, contractors, timelines. I nodded where appropriate, chewed slowly, smiled when I was supposed to, but my skin still carried the memory of another man's eyes on my bare. After dinner, I cleared the plates while the television hummed in the background. He was half watching, half scrolling through his phone. I knew his patterns by now, what distracted him, what he'd ignore, what he would assume was fatigue or a shift in mood. He didn't notice the way I lingered at the sink, or how my hand trembled slightly when I turned off the faucet. That night, I stood in front of the mirror wearing the emerald gift. The strap sat perfectly on my shoulders, the cut lifted and exposed in just the right places. I didn't recognize myself immediately, not because I looked different, but because I felt different. Not younger, not prettier, just more awake. There was something quietly thrilling in knowing he had chosen this for me without a word, that he had understood not just the outer me, but the part that had been quietly overlooked, not by cruelty, but by years of being gently forgotten. I put on a sweater and loose pants over it, the kind of clothes that made me invisible. I told myself I was only wearing it because I wanted to feel it against my skin, that I wouldn't let him see. But I walked into the living room and saw him there, reading. He glanced up and stopped. His eyes held mine longer than necessary. They flicked down then back up. No smile, no words, but I knew he knew. I sat across from him and pulled a blanket over my lap.
He said nothing.
Neither did he. My husband was already asleep by the time I went to bed. I slid under the covers beside him and closed my eyes. I tried to focus on his breath, the familiar rise and fall of his chest. I tried